All righty. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm so excited for today's webinar on how AI can help turbocharge your team's productivity. We're going to let a few more folks trickle in here that are joining. We know that noon is always that time in between meetings, so we'll wait just one more minute before everybody joins. Awesome. Well, let's get started here. My name is Melanie Fellay, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Spekit. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, I love joining lots of conferences and webinars on the future of enablement. I'll be joining Arias's upcoming conference up in Chicago. But my name is Melanie Fellay. About 8 years ago, I set out to really reimagine what enablement looks like in a world where enablement really is delivered contextually to your reps in the moment of need. And I've spent a lot of time really thinking through the meaty, really challenging problems of content management and learning and how we can really reimagine it in a world of AI. And so I'm really looking forward today to having this discussion. I really like engagement, so feel free to jump in, ask questions, add comments. I want to hear from you, and I like to think that it makes these webinars a little bit more interesting. So with that, today we're going to just spend a couple minutes here just orienting around just the AI landscape for reps. There's a lot happening, and so just taking a moment there to focus in. Then we'll talk a little bit about the content discovery and delivery problem. Then we'll go into what the future holds. What are some of the predictions that I see in terms of how the world is evolving, particularly as it pertains to enablement. And then we'll discuss what are the different ways that AI can help solve this problem. So with that, let's get started. Let's start with the AI landscape for reps. The reality is that we're all focused on revenue and rep performance. If you're in enablement, if you're in revenue operations, if you're in learning, at the end of the day, we are all supporting our teams with helping expand market share, shortening sales cycles, curbing customer churn, increasing ACV, accelerating quota attainment, how to retain and onboard top performers. And we're all focused ultimately on driving maximum impact, right? And so many of you probably have an OKR somewhere in your company related to one of these. But let's address the elephant in the room, right? How do we figure out what to do? Now, if you look at Nancy Narden's technology landscape, you'll see that these are the number of tools that are available to help drive rep performance and revenue. All of these fit into different categories across the go-to-market tech stack, all promising to deliver more productivity and ROI, revenue, performance. And it's a lot to try and figure out, right? On top of that, all of these are constantly changing. For example, if we just take a look at the enablement landscape, and this is really where I found myself now 7 years ago as I was looking for a solution to our problems around enablement and performance and knowledge management, right? When it came to how do I make sure that our teams understand our tools and our workflows and processes, the answer is, well, you need a digital adoption platform. And oh, by the way, there's 30 solutions to choose from. How do I make sure that our teams understand all of our processes and policies? Well, you need a knowledge management platform. How do we make sure that our teams have the collateral and marketing information they need? Well, you need a CMS. And oh, by the way, there's another 50 of those platforms. Well, wait a minute. How do I make sure that our teams have the skills they need? Well, you need an LMS for that. And oh, by the way, there are literally 700 different technologies out there. And so just focusing in on one narrow problem, which is enablement, the answer up until recently has been that you need potentially 4 different categories of tools. Now, the reality is what all these solutions have in common is a foundation of content, right? Then they have different shared capabilities. You can organize your content, you can create content, you can search for content, you can manage your content. And then they have a distinct set of features that are kind of unique to each one of those categories. And then lots of bells and whistles. And so when I found myself trying to distill this, trying to figure out like what did we need, I found it incredibly challenging. And I'm sure many of you can relate as you've gone on your own evaluation journeys of different tools and different technologies. Now the lines are blurring more than ever before, right? It's a challenge to try and make sense of it and really get back focused on what problem you're trying to solve, right? Why make things so complicated? Now, it's not just that there's a lot of different tools, but every single one of those is launching new AI capabilities, right? They're all called co-pilots. They all promise, again, better rep performance, more revenue. And so the question is, what is a co-pilot? How is it going to help our reps? How is one co-pilot better than the next? There's a lot of questions that we're trying to figure out. And I don't think we have all the answers yet, But this is really the challenge that I'm hearing every single day from customers as they're looking at different solutions, as they're trying to evaluate their enablement strategy, is how do all these technologies fit into that? And the reality is that the race is on, right? If you think back to 2016, I remember when Gong and Chorus first entered the market, it was just revolutionary, right? This idea that you could record conversations, you could go back and watch those calls, you could give coaching on those calls. Now you've got transcripts, now you've got AI summaries. Back in the day, those were innovation. Now you've got every platform under the sun that's building in conversation intelligence. It's quickly moved to a commodity. So the sheer pace of AI, the sheer pace of innovation is only getting faster. It's only getting cheaper to build and faster to build. And that means that any challenge you're facing now and trying to manage your tech stack and keep track of your content and knowledge and enablement is only going to continue to accelerate. And the reality is that in a world of increased acceleration in terms of pace of innovation, right, you also need, you also need for increased learning agility, right? The pace at which your team can learn and absorb new information and new change. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? Let's take your typical rep today. Well, the first thing is that they've got a ton of different tools that we expect them to learn and master. We expect them to be pipeline experts, right? There's been a big shift back to full cycle AEs, where AEs aren't just taking in the meetings from their SDRs, but they're actually generating their own pipeline. That means they need to be experts at prospecting. They need to know your playbooks. They need to know how to forecast and follow your methodology. They also need to be product experts, right? They need to keep track of all the different products you're launching, the different features and benefits and capabilities. They need to value sell and go from selling one product to now a platform, which it seems like everyone's doing in the market, right? You need to know how to handle the different objections and competitive landscape, but they also need to be collateral experts, right? They need to know exactly which deck to use and when, what piece of collateral to use for what deal, what case study should we use for this industry and this use case. And finally, they also need to be systems experts, right? As all of these different tools that we just talked about are changing their tech stack, whether it's UI changes, right? A lot of technologies over the last couple of years have been reinventing their UI with the lens of AI in mind, right? So they need to keep track of all the different UI changes, they need to keep track of all of your workflow changes, you launch new pricing and packaging, that's going to be reflected somewhere in your quoting system, right? And so all of this is just what we expect reps to know to do their job. And we wonder why they're struggling. And on top of that, every single one of these is constantly changing. Your competitor launching capabilities, your team now needs to know that new talk track and that battle card. Your product team launched a new integration, your team now needs to know how to speak to it. All of this change is inundating our reps. And it's taking every capacity that they have in terms of their cognitive load to think critically and prepare for calls away because they're inundated with noise in Slack, in their email, live trainings, you name it. And so what I believe is that the answer isn't that you need to do more enablement to keep track of all this change. Instead, you need to start reoriented to what does more effective enablement look like? How can you really rethink how you're delivering enablement in a way that's really personalized and tailored to each rep? So let's talk a little bit about the content discovery and delivery problem, because I ultimately believe from all the conversations I've had over the last years, talking to literally thousands of organizations, that content delivery and discovery is the number one thing that's stepping in the way between all that enablement work that you're doing, all of those efforts, and really driving the impact that we know is possible. So first, let's talk about the content delivery problem, right? Most companies are still approaching enablement this way, right? They put employees through a one-size-fits-all onboarding, right? Regardless of whether that rep has sold for 10 years or 5. And Maura, yes, please go ahead and launch the poll. Actually, let's wait one quick question. Let's see, before we go into this, you'll see a poll here in the chat. The goal is to make this a little bit interesting. Please feel free to answer, how do you deliver enablement today? Live trainings, LMS, CMS, Google Drive. You should be able to select a few of these options. Awesome, Maura, let's check results. Oops. Well, unfortunately, oh, there we go. So primarily live trainings and LMS, it looks like. And someone is using just-in-time enablement. That's great. Oh, it's single answer only. My apologies. Well, at least here we've got a good sense. Awesome. I'd imagine then that if that were the case, there's a few other answers there. But the reality is that whether someone's been a seller for 8 years or 2 years, right, they're likely going through the same onboarding as part of their first few weeks in your company, right? And the challenge is that it might not necessarily be relevant in that moment. It's not effective for attention, and it really creates this check the box mentality. Then you also have mandatory team meetings and live trainings, right? And so you're asking everyone to join at a specific time, and you're trying to do attendance, you're driving attendance, you're tracking engagement, yet folks aren't paying it fully attention. They can't remember it afterwards. There's lots of challenges. And then when it comes to delivering communications, right? You're sending your weekly or biweekly revenue enablement newsletter, you're sending communications. The challenge is that there's so many channels and so much noise that they often go ignored, and there's really no way to measure. And at the end of the day, what we know, right? Speaking of this firm, I don't need to go through with the forgetting curve because we all know it, but the reality is that we know that that doesn't work. We know that that's not how adult learners retain information. And it's simply because the time between when information is delivered versus when, or absorbed, excuse me, to when it's applied, there's too long of a time lapse, making it both difficult for employees to retain it, but also difficult to understand, did that live training we do actually drive impact? Did that course that the employee took in their first couple of weeks of joining the company actually impact their first deal? It's really difficult to understand what's actually working, how it's impacting your revenue and performance. The reality, though, is that we know that when information is reinforced, right, when it comes down to your memory function, right, and your ability to take that information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, the probability that that information is absorbed dramatically increases, as it's reviewed and as it's reinforced. Basically, the more times you consume information, the more likely it is that you're going to remember it, right? So reinforcement is absolutely critical to ultimately transferring that information into knowledge that your team actually has and can apply every single day. Now, the other problem, though, isn't just in the delivery approach. It's also in the discovery, right? From a lot of employees, we hear that information is hard to find, right? It's not easily accessible. It's out of context. They forget that it even exists. They don't know what to search for. And when they go search for it, they can't find what they need. And that's often has to do with the fact that there is really clunky systems, right, that are difficult to organize and really difficult to maintain. And ultimately that leads to a nightmare, which is you've got tons of outdated content, you've got low usage, right, of your enablement, which is just frustrating for marketing and everyone involved. And it's really just, again, hard to identify what's working. And Moira, go ahead and launch the poll. So I'm curious, do these challenges that we've just discussed around content discovery and delivery feel familiar to you? Let's take a quick look. Okay, sounds like everyone feels the pain to a certain degree of these challenges. And for what it's worth, you're not alone. I think everybody under the sun does. I'm reluctant to say that, but even we still face some of these challenges, and we are trying to solve this problem. So you're not alone. It's a problem that I'm deeply passionate to try and solve in the marketplace. Now, the reality is that the impact is pretty significant, right? We won't spend too much time on here because we all know it, but at the end of the day, the result here is that you've got ineffective, unprepared reps, right? They're not spending enough time selling. They don't know your products and services and their ability to speak to the value at the level they need to. They can't keep track of all the change happening in your products and services to sell the latest and greatest, so they're losing deals that they shouldn't be losing. That's frustrating. You're also seeing a huge level of manager burnout. Harvard Business Review showed that over 53% of managers feel burnt out. And I can tell you, at least from my personal conversations, a lot of enablement professionals feel that pain too, right? Being asked more, but not seeing the wins, feeling like they're pulled in 25 different directions, trying to shift priorities every single day. It's exhausting. And it's difficult to actually see the impact, right? Forrester came out with a study just a couple of years ago that showed that the average organization has over 70% of their content that goes unused. Now, I don't know if that means never used or not used more than once, but the reality is that we all know that we have a content graveyard out there of great content that didn't see its full day in terms of success. And here's my belief, right? I believe the ugly truth, hopefully you catch the movie reference here, is that your reps just don't care. They don't care until they do, right? They don't care about that new feature or that new competitive update until they're in that very deal, in that very situation where they need that information, where they need that knowledge. And it's our responsibility to make it as simple as possible to deliver and surface that information to them when they need it, when it's relevant to them in a simple and personalized way. And really shifting from let's create trainings and deliver trainings and creating content just in case people need that information in that moment, to really how do we take that same information and deliver it just in time when it's going to be the most relevant to them. And ultimately, it's because we live in a just-in-time world, right? It's a time where we're used to seeing all the latest updates, right? All of us are likely tracking the tragic situation that's unfolding in Florida right now with the hurricane, checking the news and constantly getting updated and reminders, right? We're used to everything being instant and easy. We're used to being able to click on Amazon and get something delivered to our doorstep, one click on Uber and get a car delivered wherever you are, right? It's not just your reps, right? That is just society and how technology has evolved to make us expect things instantly before getting frustrated. And the reality is that there's also a lot of evidence that shows that reps and adult learners want to learn by doing, right? McKinsey and LinkedIn both have come out with various studies that show that adult learners remember a lot more when they learn by doing, right? 65% of that information. And that there's actually a preference here too, that employees actually prefer to learn by doing and prefer to learn at their own pace. So the question is, and over here to the right, you'll see that there's another study. I actually believe this one was by Bain. Sorry, I should have made the note, but that there's a difference in the performance overall of an organization based on how they approach learning and training for their sellers as well. And that at the end of the day, when you focus on training your sellers, just the cohort of sellers to whom the information applies to, you see a much higher performance overall as an organization versus a one-size-fits-all training approach. So the question is, how can we approach this, right? How can we do this? Well, the first thing is, and this isn't unique to Spekit, this is unique to a lot of other platforms that are moving in this direction, right? The shift from just in time means that instead of your prospecting plays and sales process and the information that your reps need to use in their day-to-day living buried in 20-page documents somewhere deep in a CMS or your Google Drive, right? Instead, actually surfacing that information to them directly where they're actually doing that prospecting work, where they're actually needing to apply that information or find those resources. That means that instead of rolling out your new sales stages and new sales process in a live webinar that no one's paying attention to, instead you're actually reinforcing that information directly within the systems that your team needs to use. So this is really kind of the approach that we've taken for a long time with just in time. You're starting to see more and more enablement platforms out there starting to use that language, starting to move in that direction, which I think is really exciting for us as an industry, because ultimately the more innovation we have in this direction, ultimately all of us will benefit, both your enablement professionals and reps. But the real question for this webinar is, how might we leverage AI to solve this problem better than any approach has been able to solve that in the past? Right? How can AI really solve the challenge of content delivery and discovery? So first, let's imagine a world where your reps have everything they need to excel at their fingertips in the very moment they need it, right? Where you understand what they're doing, you recommend just what they need in that flow of work, and it's super, super simple for them to access and do what they need to do. That's really the vision for just in time. Now, the question is, how might we understand the reps' needs? Their unique needs based on where they are and what they're doing. How can we then identify what is it that they need in that moment so that you can eliminate their guesswork and surface the information to them before they even realize they need it, or even if they didn't know that that content existed in the first place? And how do we make it impossibly simple to use? Because we all know, based on the graveyard of tools out there that we've all had, some cases Spekit's fallen in that category, unfortunately, as well, where reps just didn't use it and adopt it because it didn't have the information that they ultimately needed. The question is, how do we solve that problem? Well, I think the first thing is to really think about, from a rep's perspective, the way I look at it is, well, there's what you know, right, in your day-to-day as a rep. There's what you don't know, right? And you don't know it. But then there's what you don't know you don't know. You didn't keep track of the last competitive update, product update, pricing, packaging change. And so you're not even aware that there's something you need to be aware of because you missed that Slack channel, you missed that email, you missed that live training, you were on paternity leave, you name it. my belief is that a lot of our reps have a much higher percentage of information here that they just don't even realize that they have a gap. So it's not just saying, well, we made it easy for them to find. They don't even know to go looking for it in the first place. And so that's really where I think that AI can really solve that content discovery challenge and delivering that right where it's needed. And AI is pretty ideal for the job, right? Because when you think about what artificial intelligence is really doing is it allows you to take a lot of unstructured data, right? That could be everything from emails to call scripts to opportunity records to other tools and systems, all of that information that we know about what your rep is doing, and translate that into structured data, right? Structured meaning that it's categorized and simple to analyze and understand, and really only focus on what matters. So you're saying, hey, take that giant call script, but only focus on what it is specifically that the rep committed to following up with, right? AI is literally designed to help solve these kind of really hairy problems that otherwise we have not been able to address without it. And so when you think about your data, right, it lives across all of your tech stack. It lives across all those tools that we saw in those first slides, right? You can think about all the information and context, right? I like to refer as data as context on across your applications, right? Whether that's in Apollo, Outreach, SalesLoft, you name it, right? At the end of the day, there's all this information about the prospect that the rep is engaging with. You've got your CRM data and all the information about the products and quotes and services. You've got calls that have all this historical context around all the information that you've heard from your buyers that may or may not be documented in your Salesforce. You've got your email exchanges where customers confirmed or asked questions that they had. All of this is unstructured data across the rep's workflow that is ultimately helping guide them on what they need to do. Now, the question is, can we remove some of that guesswork and think for them? And that's really where I think that content recommendations can really drive a big impact. And so when we think about how do we solve this problem with AI, the first piece is how can we take a call and do contextual analysis on it? Really determine what is the most critical sales context that we need to take out of this call. And you'll see that Chorus, Gong, and other platforms have already started doing that with their AI summaries, right? How can you start identifying what are the core themes, what are the core next steps and action items that are the most critical, right? We don't care that they went to a vineyard over the weekend. Well, maybe you do if you want to send a bottle of wine, but other than that, you don't really care. There's a lot of information that isn't important, but AI can be used and trained to really seek out and identify the most important context. Then how do you leverage that context to then find relevant content, right? They mentioned that they're in financial services, their use case is trying to solve for, let's say, system adoption, and they're having lots of individual pains. How can you take that and then try and find relevant content, right? And that's where AI, on the knowledge and content side, is going to be scanning all your documentation, scanning all your knowledge, scanning all your PDFs, chunking that, and looking for matches, right? And then looking, and from an intelligence layer, the way that we approach it is looking at, well, has this information been shared before, right? How does that impact the score and the relevancy, right? How recent is the content? How outdated is the content? Is there duplicate content? Is there conflicting information, right? AI can literally do all of that work within seconds to ultimately find the most relevant content. And then how do you recommend it to your reps in context in a way that they can quickly find the exact information they need and they can see that top ranked content first? This is one approach that, again, while this happens to be Spekit imagery, right, the reality is that this is ultimately how most content recommendation systems are starting to evolve. And really thinking through this piece here, this middle context, the contextual analysis, and the content retrieval, which is how do we detect what information matters? And then how do we ultimately match that to the most relevant content? That is really where the magic happens. And so that's ultimately how content recommendations work. And it's really kind of taking that evolution of content discovery, which started with let's go browse through folders and find it, to then Google Drive introduced the search bar. Actually, no more browsing through folders, right? Folders are a thing of the past. Actually, just search and you'll find the answer. To then actually, well, you can search, but you can also filter and drill down results, right? So make sure you find it. To now you can ask a question. We believe that the future is really about how do you predict, how do you recommend the resources that your team needs before they even realize they need it. And without them even knowing what question to ask, without them even knowing that they have a gap, the system can do it. And that's ultimately what we want to solve for. And we believe that you can do that across every step of the journey, right? Jason, I'm going to answer a quick question. How can we ensure that recommendations are accurate and best? Seems like a lot of opportunities for bias and potential errors. Absolutely. I think that's a really great question. It's one that we spend a lot of time thinking through. I'll touch on at the end of the webinar, but I think that there's two sides of the coin, right? There's the actual content delivery, and then there's the content accuracy, right? Today's webinar is really focused on how to deliver the best content. The real question, though, is how do you actually maintain accuracy in your content, right? How do you ensure that your content stays relevant and up to date in an automated way? And so we'll touch on that at the end, but I think that's a really, really big part of it. And that's where you start looking at, like, how can you identify conflicts in your content before they get surfaced to the user, right? Let's say that you're adding a new product and you've documented that. When you add it to your system, how can it automatically detect conflicts across all your existing content so that you can ensure that? There's also ways that you can set rules and train your model to not generate answers on its own, but to only answer based on the content that you have in the system. That's the approach we're taking today, right? Because based on a lot of the conversations we've had, a lot of customers, depending on their industry, for example, one of our customers is the ALS Association, right? And so their team is often on calls, for example, with families and individuals affected by ALS, and they might be able to answer what are certain symptoms that may or may not be indicative of ALS, but they don't want their teams being able to provide a diagnosis of ALS, for example. So depending on the industry, depending on compliance, there's going to be mechanisms that you need to think through. And that's part of what I believe is a vendor's responsibility, but that's going to need to be customizable to each industry. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think it's the most relevant and important question for us all to answer here. Because at the end of the day, and going back to the slide here, right, it's all about the different kinds of recommendations are going to matter at different points in the journey, right? So the kind of information that you provide when someone first goes to an application, right, is going to be different than once they've done that workflow 20 times and it hasn't changed, whether they need to see that again, right? Similarly, if you've surfaced a battle card before to your rep and they've seen it 5 times, unless that battle card updates, do you need to recommend it top of the list again, just because that competitor is mentioned? That all comes down to using machine learning and really training it to become more personalized over time. Because ultimately the goal is to surface content across every step of the journey, from guiding them through their workflows to help them learn faster, to ensuring that they get relevant updates, whether it's product releases, competitive updates, Salesforce, when it matters most to them to reduce that sales friction, right? Ensuring that they have the appropriate sales training, messaging as they're going through their workflows, and ultimately making sure that they have the collateral that they need so that they can share and engage their buyers with it, ultimately to drive more revenue. So the question is, though, Jason, and I actually love that you asked it because it's super relevant, is this is a big problem to solve, right? There's a lot of different facets to this problem just in getting the ranking mechanism correct. So where can we focus to drive the most impact, right? Rather than saying, hey, we surface the best content recommendations across every scenario under the world, right? Because that's the vision, but that's going to take time to accomplish. Where could we focus and optimize? So Moira, I'd love for you to launch a quick poll to get a quick sense from the team here. So the question is here, if you were to estimate across all of your reps, right, what is the average amount of time they take to prepare and follow up on a critical meeting, right? So a meeting with their prospect, so a demo. How much time goes into preparing for the call, customizing the index, demoing, creating their email draft, that follow-up? What would you estimate is the average amount of time that goes into just a single meeting in terms of preparation? Let's see what the results are here, Moira. All right, so there's a bit of a mixed distribution here. It's not surprising, right? It really depends on how much of your team is, let's say, for example, SMB sellers, where it's going to be a little bit more boilerplate, right? There's less customization versus enterprise sellers, where there's a lot more customization required, your top sellers versus bottom of the pile. But the reality is that it's a lot of time that goes into helping your reps ultimately be really successful. And if you don't know the answer, if you're like, I really guessed this, I have no clue, I encourage you to just shadow one of your reps. It's amazing how much you'll learn by just shadowing. Last year, it's at a given point in time, I ended up having to take over as our head of sales as I was looking for a COO. And that's actually one of the first things I did is I asked our reps, like, hey, do you mind if I just shadow you as you go about the process? And it was fascinating to see how they actually went about it. It was fascinating to see the different approaches different reps took. And just how much time went into that work. So just a good follow-up email could take a lot of time. And that's why I'm really excited to see Lots of these conversation rev orchestration platforms innovating on that too. How can you auto-generate an email, right, from a given call recording? But the reality is that a lot of time goes into that, right, on top of all the other things they need to do. And so when you think about, how much time is going into that, right? Let's take 30-minute call prep, 30-minute follow-up of going and finding the resources, making sure they've got their next action items, et cetera. And an average of, let's say, 10 sales meetings a week, which is right about accurate there. They're spending just 25% of their time on meeting prep and follow-up. And our friends over at Gong show that, a lot of reps, 45% of them think that critical items fall through the cracks each week. So as we thought about, where can we really focus our energy so that we can start getting good at one thing, right, and optimizing for one area, we really wanted to focus on where reps spend the most time. And all of our rep research, all the interviews that we've done indicate that that's where it happens. And that when there is a really good follow-up email, right, when there is really good tailored follow-up, there's a significant improvement in win rate. And this is according to Gong's research across all of their different customers. And that really has to do with sharing relevant buyer information, right, action items, and within 48 hours. And that there's also a huge impact when you respond quickly, right? You're not waiting because you didn't have time to go find the resource, that you didn't know where it was. And so you need to go Slack and ask your solution engineer, the drill, right? It also leads to significant shorter deal duration and improve win rates, all of which we are trying to improve significantly. And that just has to do with how fast your reps are able to respond to emails within a sales cycle. So with that in mind, the real question is, how do we ultimately determine what are the best recommendations to surface, right? How do we understand what a rep's needs are in any given moment? Well, the first question is, who are they, right? What is their role? What is their tenure, right? What are they doing? What tool are they in? What workflow and why? For example, if they're in Gong, right, and they're looking at a call, can we just assume that they're following up? Well, it really depends on when was the time of that call. If that call was today, right, it's likely that they're preparing a follow-up. But if that call was 2 weeks ago, they're probably preparing for their next call. And so the kinds of recommendations you might want to inform are going to be different based on that, right? The kind of enablement that you're going to recommend if someone's in preparation mode is going to be different than if they're in follow-up mode, et cetera. Then the next question is, who are they talking to, right? What do we know about the customer, their industry, their problems? And then finally, what are their needs, right? What have we determined from the CRM, from the call recordings, from the emails and transcripts around what they might ultimately want to follow up with? And then the question is, well, what kind of content is best at what stage, right? How do you train the AI to really understand that? Well, if you kind of break down your overall sales process, right, and not just sales process, but the employee journey from like, what is the most critical information when they're onboarding, to when they're doing account planning, to when they're prospecting, to then when they're managing their pipeline, to when they're doing quoting, to then ongoing customer success. There's different content that's more relevant at different steps of the journey, right? So if you understand what they're doing, where they are in their journey, you can then train the model to say, hey, based off of where you're at, recommend more of this type of content, right? Because, for example, advanced quoting guidelines and pricing guidelines might not be as relevant to a rep as they're going into a discovery call as it is when they're in stage 3 or stage 4. So all of this context is needed to really understand across your technology stack, what is the rep doing in that moment? And how do we remove that thinking from them so that they can really think critically about that call, prepare for that call, be really, really honed in, and make sure they're doing that deeper level of discovery that we all want. They're asking why 5 times until they get to that bottom answer. Right now, my belief, at least in observing our own reps and in talking to a lot of reps, is there's so much noise that's filling our reps' minds every day that's why they're struggling on the fundamentals. I can't tell you how many companies I've spoken to over the last 18 months of really this, tech recession, whatever you want to call it, that have said, we're back to the fundamentals. We're refocusing on the fundamentals. We're back to the basics. It's like every company had a theme in that orientation, which was just like, how do we get our reps doing the basic things right? And it really came from the fact that we were throwing too much at them and not getting the basics right. So with that in mind, how can we really transform follow-up strategies? How can AI automate and enhance these actions, allowing your sales team to maintain consistent personalized engagement? Well, we believe that AI can help in a few different ways, right? So one is with content recommendations, right, which we've spoken to. The other one is really providing in-the-moment assistance so that you can ask questions and get guidance based on the information and enablement that your organization has, whether that's helping with positioning or messaging, right, or whether that's ultimately recommending content. And we've really focused at least right now, on meeting prep and follow-up, right? Because that's where we believe we can have the biggest impact and learn from how reps are doing that, learn what kind of enablement is most effective, learn about what reps actually care about, what enablement do they tend to use and find valuable, and see how it actually impacts that deal to then understand, great, how do you extrapolate that across the entire employee journey? And so that's really where we focus. And so from a product standpoint, right, and my goal is not to make this a Spekit pitch, but more so to reorient your thinking into kind of where the future is going, because you'll start seeing, again, this across a lot of different tools out there, albeit different approaches, that, across your email, whether it's Gmail and Outlook, across Gong, Salesloft, or other conversation intelligence tools, recommendations can be surfaced across every step. Right? Again, using Outlook Desktop, a lot of companies, their reps who are on the Microsoft suite are using the Outlook Desktop version. And so again, surfacing that content to them in their flow of work so they don't need to leave. You're not even asking them to search, right? You can just recommend that information that they need right there. And then finally, it's also thinking through Salesforce opportunities, right? And this is really in the earlier stages of development, but how can, based off of all the information on an opportunity, can you recommend, again, the best answer, the best content around product guidance or competition, case study, sales process? Based on our analysis, that's the kind of information that reps are seeking the most whenever they're on in a deal. How can we surface that to them and make sure that they're aware that this information exists before they even realize they need it? And more importantly, how do you do this in a way where you, as an enablement professional, aren't spending your days having to go manually map this content to this stage and this content to this field? Because at the end of the day, the reason why so many enablement professionals feel like their heads are about to blow up is that the amount of admin time required for these existing platforms ultimately takes away from focusing on the number one thing that matters most, which is delivering and creating really high impact content. So with that, I'll show just a couple examples just to illustrate what I'm referring to here, because I think it brings it quite a bit into perspective. So first, let's take a call. This happens to be Gong. This could be in Chorus or other conversation intelligence tools. But let's say I'm a rep. I just went on this call, right? This happens to be a call where it's with a wealth management company. They want to clarify client onboarding. We heard some key points around them not having a full staff admin, their user experience with Salesforce, right? There were some benefits of Spekit spoken here. There's competitors noted, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a bunch of information about content creation and licensing. So there's all this context, right? So the question is, as rep, right, what kind of information might I want to share? What information should I share, right? And where does that information live? Well, with Spekit, regardless of whether that source information is in SharePoint or Google Drive, or whether you've actually managed it and created in Spekit, right? When you open up Spekit here in the sidebar, and this is using our Chrome extension, so you'll see that this experience is the same everywhere. You'll see that Spekit's really designed to be that natural extension of their workflow here. So it doesn't even look and feel like Spekit. It feels like, in this case, the Revenue Enablement Society's extension, where right here, they can simply open it on the side here and see the most relevant content. So here, after my call, I could look and see, maybe I want to send this presentation on Spekit for Salesforce. Or maybe I want to review information on Spekit Salesforce integration. And you'll see that you can clearly delineate what's shareable externally here versus what's something that's for internal enablement like this. Or, hey, here's a one-pager on Spekit for financial services customers, right? So you can surface all this information. You can view more here. And of course, the rep can actually view that content right here directly within their flow of work, right? So they don't need to go elsewhere to go look at the content. They can actually review it right here. They can download it. They can expand it. They can do all that fun stuff, right? But the idea is that they can view that right here. And then if they wanted to, they could share that externally with their buyer. Or you can go into different themes, right? Here, Spekit's detected that based on this call, here are a few different themes that were mentioned, right? So maybe you want to focus more on, let's say, content creation. So here, Spekit's going to touch on a few different approaches that we have, like, hey, here's a Spekit general overview. Here's the Spekit content library, etc. So is it perfect? No. But is it surfacing content and removing that time that they would otherwise have to go look for information? Absolutely. And so that's just one approach in a solution like Gong, but you can also take that in your email, right? Let's say that we just had a call here with a prospect and did a demo, right? In this instance, the customer is really struggling with their content management. They want to centralize it. They want to surface it. And the next steps discussed were, hey, let's schedule a demo with your director of enablement. Again, as a rep, I can just open my Spekit extension here, my assistant. And again, Spekit's going to recommend content here that's most relevant. So here, because we said, hey, schedule a demo with the head of sales, it looks like it detected you might want to share this one pager, right? Or you could go into AI recommendations. Since it sounds like there's a little video here, you might want to see where it's like, hey, you've got a feature here. Or let's go through and see if there's something better. Okay, great. Looks like there's a video here that I might want to share and view. So again, the whole idea is how can you predict what a rep needs in the moment, whether they're in Gong, in Gmail, or again in Salesforce here. So here, for those of you that have heard of Spekit before, you might know us for kind of our bread and butter, which is the ability to embed guidance wherever the rep is, right? So your sales process can be embedded right here so that as your reps are going through their stage 2 opportunity, they can easily understand what resources are available for them to prepare, right? Whether that's your account research plan and how to approach that, whether that's your exit criteria, et cetera. You can embed content directly next to your specific fields, et cetera. But in this instance, you can see that in this opportunity, they're looking for a better content management solution, enablement platform. And so when I open Spekit up here, it's going to, again, understand this and recommend content. So here it clearly detected that there's a specific product that the customer is interested in. So here's a bunch of external enablement, and then here's internal enablement as well with your talk track, et cetera. So again, all of this is done fully automatically. You don't need to go in and manually tag and do all that mapping. That takes so much time away, but you can still deliver that content where your teams need it. So I won't spend too much time on this because I don't want to take away from really the goal of this presentation, but I do think it's helpful to show some examples. And again, none of this is perfect yet. I think as vendors that are venturing in AI, it's important to recognize that we're all learning, we're all experimenting with what is the best way to rank content and score content and do embeddings, et cetera. But the promise is there, right? And I wholeheartedly believe that this is the direction that enablement is going. And it's not to say that live trainings or LMS courses are a thing of the past. I do believe there's a time and place for them. But I think that the amount of information that you deliver there versus the amount of information that's going to move towards being delivered in a more just-in-time motion that's predictive and personalized to your reps is going to significantly shift. And I think the right companies are really starting to make that shift now as these different innovative solutions are coming on the market, because really it comes down to how can you drive more content adoption, right? You're creating great content, making sure that it's getting used, reducing content waste, and ultimately having the impact that you believe you can have on sales performance. Now, the other question though, right? This sounds like a great promise, right? AI recommendations, AI answers, awesome, right? Every tool under the sun is starting to do that. But to answer Jason's question earlier, how do we ensure accurate, trustworthy information? Because at the end of the day, when I talk to teams, it's the number one thing that they don't have. They either don't have the content in the first place, or if they have it, they're like, well, it's a black hole. It's buried in a spot or somewhere, and half of it isn't relevant, half of it is out of date, and it's on my to-do list to do a content audit and blah, 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 and somehow you never do it. And ultimately, it's the second side of the coin, right? You can solve the content discovery problem, but at the end of the day, our recommendations are only going to be as good as your underlying content. If you don't have the content, you're going to recommend the next best thing, which isn't that great, right? Right now, we've taken the approach of let's recommend the next best thing, even if it's not perfect, which is why sometimes you see results that aren't perfect. Another approach could say, hey, if it's not meeting a certain threshold of relevancy, don't show it all, right? But ultimately, we're doing that because we want to really learn rep preferences and understand what feels relevant to them versus making that judgment call ourselves. But the accuracy problem is a real one, right? And I think more and more you're hearing companies as they're starting to experiment with AI. So they're looking at different co-pilots from Microsoft, et cetera, right? I just spoke to the CEO of a large bank customer of ours, and he said that they're not integrating Microsoft's Copilot into their SharePoint because he knows that their SharePoint is a mess. He knows that it's out of date. So the real question is, how do we solve the underlying problem of content governance and accuracy, right? How can we ensure that information stays up to date as business change? How do we reduce duplicate content and all the efforts that go into communicating and duplicating efforts? Well, we need it in our LMS, but we also need to deliver it live, right? How do you make it so that it's one resource that you reuse and repurpose in different ways? How do you eliminate the need for content audits forever? Right? That queue of things you need to review, bye. How do you automate capturing the best, most relevant information and knowledge in the field? And ultimately, how do you drive maximum consistency across your content? These are the questions that we're spending a lot of times asking ourselves. If I had more time, I would do a whole nother webinar on this because there's a whole other side of things that I'm really excited to innovate on. But I encourage you instead to come to our workshop that we're hosting not next week, in 2 weeks from now at the RES conference. It's in Chicago, October 21st to 23rd, where we're going to be bringing the most brilliant minds in enablement all together. I hope to see you all there, really starting to focus on how can we build a really effective library, right? The number one asked during onboarding, and even when I get pulled into calls now still with some of our existing customers is, what does good look like? What are your best practices? How can, as an enablement professional, how can we share those best practices amongst each other, amongst ourselves around like, what does a really good objection handling spec look like? Or piece of content, excuse me. What does a really good talk track guidance look like? How can we build a library of templates that all of us can benefit from that will be available on the RES library? So I'm partnering with the wonderful Siobhan. Many of you likely recognize her. She's absolutely amazing. She has a lot of thoughts on this topic. And you're going to get some hands-on practice really in groups, learning from each other and building the most effective content templates to accelerate your enablement efforts. And so with that, ultimately, if you're looking to learn more, if you're looking to engage, we're really pioneering here this new approach of just-in-time learning, just-in-time enablement. I'm really passionate about this vision, and I'd love to hear from all of you. For those of you that are customers, appreciate you all listening in. But for those of you that haven't heard of us or only looked at the platform, let's say a year ago, a lot has changed. So take a look. I love connecting with you all, right? We're really focused on 3 things: how to make it stupid simple to access content, curate content, and ultimately manage and measure it. And we've got a lot of customers that have had a lot of success with that approach. So really where we're going from an innovation standpoint, in case you're curious, is really designing the best personalized enablement assistant for reps, making it impossibly easy to curate high impact enablement content, and the holy grail, the promise, which we haven't delivered on quite yet, but really the end goal is how can we start quantifying the impact of enablement on actual rep performance? What content actually matters? What content are you creating that's not delivering results? How can we really address that? And so that is ultimately what I'm dedicating my life, frankly, to solving. So if you've got ideas, would love to hear them. If this content resonated with you, please reach out. And I'll be sharing a few content templates in the follow-up email so that you all can get an idea of that. Awesome. So if you want to learn more, go to our G2 or go to spekit.com-AI. So with that, hopefully you all get about 15 minutes left back in your day so that you can focus on other things, catch up before your next meeting. And again, I'll just put my name here in the chat. My name is Melanie Fellay, CEO of Spekit. Please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're attending RES, send me a note. Would love to grab coffee. Thanks so much. Have a great one.